Hey everyone, it's Professor Clark, and we are now in Chapter 9. Woohoo! We are making lots of progress, lots of motion to go with the topic of these two chapters, Chapters 8 and Chapter 9. And in Chapter 9, we're going to get into more detail with verbs of motion, and specifically, we're going to look at prefixed verbs of motion. So in Chapter 8, we learned the 8 basic pairs of unprefixed verbs of motion. And in Chapter 9, we're going to learn about how we can add prefixes to these verbs of motion to add additional information about the type of motion we're describing. And we're going to start off with the prefix på. So, as you may remember, we can add the prefix på to pretty much any verb, and it will make that verb perfective. Whatever that verb is, once we add the prefix på, the verb becomes perfective. And this prefix på has two main meanings, and this is the case for any verb, and we will see in later slides how this comes into play with verbs of motion. But for any verb, when we have the prefix på, it can indicate the initiation or inception of action. That is to say, the start of an action. So, for instance, я ее полюбил. We took любить, we added по, and that means to fall in love or to start to love someone. So, я ее полюбил means something like I fell in love with her or I started to love her. Or я вдруг почувствовал себя намного лучше. I suddenly started feeling a lot better. So чувствовать себя is to feel, like to feel bad, to feel good. And if we make it perfective with the prefix по, this means that you changed how you feel, you started to feel a different way. So я вдруг почувствовал себя намного лучше is I suddenly started feeling a lot better. The other meaning of the prefix på with pretty much any verb can be to do something for a little bit or some kind of action of short duration. So, for instance, я немножко почитала means I read for a little bit. We took читать, which is imperfective. We added the prefix по, and it becomes perfective, and it means to read for a little bit. Or я немножко поспала. I slept for a little bit. I had a nap. And we took the verb spot, to sleep, imperfective. We added på, it becomes perfective, and it also takes on this meaning of doing something for a little bit, so it's like to have a little nap. So those are the two basic meanings of the prefix på with pretty much any verb, starting to do something or doing something for a short period of time. So what happens when we add på to verbs of motion? Well, it depends on the directionality of the verb. So let's start with unidirectional verbs of motion. When we add på to a unidirectional verb of motion, it makes the verb perfective. Remember that these unidirectional verbs of motion are imperfective. So идти, ехать, and so on and so forth, they're all imperfective. We add på to any of them, and they become perfective. And it also has this meaning of starting the motion or setting off on a trip. And we often use this in commands or invitations to say, let's go somewhere. So for instance, я пойду домой means I will go home or I will set off for home. And we're indicating that we're going to set off, we're going to start for home. If we say something like, давай пойдем в ресторан, let's go to a restaurant, we're also going to use this по form of пойти. And we use the давай plus the мы form of the perfective to mean let's go do something. And the important thing here is setting off for the restaurant. So давай пойдем в ресторан. Or we can just say пойдем or поедем to mean let's go. Пойдем if we're going on foot. Поедем if we are going by vehicle. And then another thing we can do, especially with verbs of motion, is we give invitations or commands by using the past tense. So we can use these forms, these по plus unidirectional verbs, in the past tense to mean let's go. So пошли is let's go on foot, let's set off on foot. Поехали is let's set off by vehicle. Another meaning of these по verbs, по plus unidirectional verbs of motion, like пойти and поехать, is it means that you set off somewhere and you're still there, you haven't come back. So for instance, if we say Жанна поехала во Францию, it means Жанна has gone to France and she's still there. Or Вова пошел в библиотеку. Vova has gone to the library and he's still there. So the past tense of пойти, поехать, and so on and so forth can have this meaning of going somewhere and still being there. And you can compare this to the past tense of an unprefixed multidirectional verb of motion, which means to go there and come back. So Жанна ездила во Францию means Жанна went to France and came back. Вова ходил в библиотеку. Vova went to the library and came back. So in the first examples, Жанна поехала во Францию and Vova пошел в библиотеку, they've set off and they haven't come back. They're still there is the implication. In the second examples, Жанна ездила во Францию and Vova ходил в библиотеку, they set off and they came back because we have a multidirectional verb of motion. And what about по plus multidirectional verbs of motion? When we add по to a multidirectional verb of motion, the verb is once again perfective because по always makes its verb perfective, and it indicates multidirectional or aimless motion of short duration. So it's to do something for a little bit. Like мы немножко походили по городу means we walked around town for a little bit. We took a little walk around town. We didn't go anywhere in particular. We were just sort of walking around town, but for a short duration. Or мы немножко поплавали. We went for a short swim. We didn't swim anywhere in particular. There was no particular destination or goal. We just swam laps or something like that for a few minutes. Or мы немножко полетали. We went for a short flight or we flew a little bit. And that would be if, for example, you went on a quick joyride on a small airplane or something like that. That's as opposed to taking some kind of transatlantic flight and going somewhere. This is just you went for a short flight, you flew around a little bit, like you flew around town on a biplane or something like that. So there you have it. Remember, по plus unidirectional verbs of motion indicates the inception of action. It means setting off on your trip. And по plus multidirectional verbs of motion indicates doing something for a short period of time. In both cases, they are perfective. And so that is an introduction to some prefixed verbs of motion. In the next lecture, we're going to get into it with a lot more depth.